In this episode, we are going to talk about an event which had momentous consequences for the history of the freedom struggle. The Rowlatt Satyagraha, which was the first occasion when Gandhi decided to launch an all India agitation against imperialism on the strength of his experience with Satyagraha initially at South Africa and then in some limited areas, localized satyagrahas in Champaran, Kheda and Ahmedabad. The Rowlatt Satyagraha, as you know, was organized outside the rubric of the Congress. So, this was an agitation which was seeking to reorient the Congress towards a new kind of political strategy which the congressmen were unwilling to take. You know that even the Swadeshi agitation, despite the attempt by the Swadeshi leaders to involve the people, it remained an elitist affair by and large. So it was an occasion when a large number of people, ordinary people, artisans, were brought within the agitational politics unleashed by one of the greatest nationalist leaders of this country. Lastly, it actually gave a lie to the idea that the masses in India were so inert that they could never be organized in a massive agitation. So Rowlatt agitation has its own significance because of all these reasons, that it was the first attempt by Gandhi to organize a massive all India agitation, and it was actually directed towards reorienting the Congress to a new kind of political strategy. But whenever you actually try to understand an event of this proportion, of this magnitude, one has to make a distinction between the long-term political processes and an event. An event often acts as a kind of a catalyst to grievances which had already been accumulating in different areas for different reasons. In a country like India, where you have so many different regions and they are actually separated by great distances, you may have many local grievances accumulating over time, and one or another event would actually emerge which would act as a kind of a catalyst which would turn these local grievances into a massive agitation. There may be local grievances, but a stage may arrive when many of these local grievances would eventually converge to create a massive agitation on an all India scale. So this is a point which any student of history must always reckon, that you can actually have a processual explanation in terms of which you can come across a large variety of local variations in national politics, but in spite of that, there may be some of these momentous events like the Rowlatt Satyagraha which would actually act as a catalyst, which would enable.
Sir, considering your arguments then, what do you think is the importance of this issue in the mass mobilization that Gandhi was hoping to achieve?
So I get your point. I mean, in other words, you are actually trying to get an answer to the question regarding the reasons for Gandhi's choosing this occasion for undertaking this massive agitation. In the first place, you must realize that the Rowlatt Act, in the manner it was enacted in the Imperial Legislative Council, evoked widespread condemnation in the public sphere. Newspapers began to comment on the pernicious character of this legislation. People in political associations were unhappy about the manner in which this act was passed through an indecent haste. This law was based on the recommendations of a committee that the government has set up under the presidency of Justice S.T. Rowlatt. The government mandate was for Rowlatt to suggest a measure which would be able to contain revolutionary activities, especially when the Defence of India rule, which was a kind of wartime restriction that the government has imposed on revolutionary movement in India, was going to lapse. So the government was in a quandary. They were groping for a policy that they should adopt in order to contain possible revolutionary violence in India. pinpointing three particular regions as the greatest trouble spots, Bengal, Maharashtra and Punjab as usual. And Rowlatt was given this brief, and Rowlatt came up with the suggestion that there should be provision for detention without trial. Trial should be held in camera without the jury. So a great amount of authority should be invested in a small bench of judges to be able to pronounce appropriate punishments for the revolutionaries in a manner that would actually disallow any public scrutiny of this kind of judicial decisions. So that made the Rowlatt Act such an oppressive legislation. And the government knew this, because the way the government had to push through this legislation in the imperial legislature actually demonstrates the essentially malicious character of this law. The entire non-official membership in the Imperial Legislative Council, those Indians who were nominated to the Imperial Legislative Council and non-official members, protested against this, and one of them actually from central provinces, his name was B.D. Shukul, he in fact resigned. So this kind of a widespread condemnation against the proposed law in the imperial legislature certainly made Rowlatt Act a very important occasion for Gandhi to use in order to launch this first major all India agitation. For Gandhi, this was an important event because this demonstrated to Gandhi the essentially malicious character of imperialism, the satanic character of imperialism, an idea that had already been formed in his mind because of his assessment of the destructive impact of imperialism on Indian economy, in Indian society, a sentiment that was adequately articulated in his book Hinsa Raj. Gandhi had already formed his opinion about imperialism possessing a kind of a devilish character. All this became much more exposed during 1919 when this act was passed, and Gandhi thought that the Rowlatt Act, it actually brings out the character of imperialism as a devilish phenomenon. So it was important for Gandhi to organize an agitation against this devilish law unleashed by a devilish system of governance. On this realization, Gandhi intervenes to undo this law, and he planned it perfectly in the Gandhian style. You have already come to know how he considered morality to be very important in political life. There should be some consistency between ends and means. Non-violence should be practiced, not as a strategy, but as a matter of principle. So his idea was that Congress was not likely to lap up this idea easily because there were people who didn't actually endorse this agitational strategy. People who are moderates, people who at that time were willing to work the reforms that Montagu, the Liberal Secretary of State of England, has offered. A section of the Indian political leadership, a section of the Congress leadership was not likely to respond to this idea of agitation favorably. Instead, they would be willing to work the reforms, and for which reasons some of them had already broken away from the Congress and formed the Indian Liberal Party. Gandhi felt that one might actually try this agitation outside the rubric of the Congress by setting up a Satyagraha Sabha. He set up a Satyagraha Sabha at Bombay, where Gandhi had greater amount of influence, and also Gujarat was a neighboring state where Gandhi had connections, old connections, with some amount of following as well in the province. So this Satyagraha Sabha was assigned the responsibility of publishing literature which would make people aware of the nature of this legislation and would make people ready for the kind of Satyagraha that Gandhi was planning. Now, this was his attempt to organize a movement.
Sir, how did Gandhi, a relatively newcomer in Indian politics, manage to organize such a movement?
That is an important question, and that has been addressed by historians a number of times. Several historians have worked on this subject, and they wish to point out that in his attempt to organize this kind of a satyagraha, Gandhi relied on three different kinds of political networks. One was the Home Rule League. You all know that Gandhi, on his arrival in India, became associated with the Home Rule League. And among the members of the Home Rule League, there were younger people who were also very articulate in the Congress as well. These younger men were not happy with the way the moderates were responding so enthusiastically to Montagu's reform proposals. They knew that tangible powers were still eluding the Indians, and their disaffection about the Montagu Declaration was articulated in the Congress session at Delhi in 1918. So there were some men in the Congress or in the mainstream nationalist movement who were not happy with the Montagu Declaration. People who were members of the Home Rule League and who wished a new leader to arrive to enable the launching of a major agitation against the government. Secondly, Gandhi had already developed political networks, some networks of support in Western India. You are all aware of the two important movements with which Gandhi became associated at Ahmedabad and Kheda. At Gujarat, in Gujarat, he had a kind of a natural following and his own familial and old connections. Bombay was one area where Gandhi was very active. So the Satyagraha Sabha, when it was founded, when it was established to start this Satyagraha against the Rowlatt Bill, was set up in Bombay. So you have some local connections in Bombay and Gujarat which gave Gandhi a measure of strength. Thirdly, and that is where I think Gandhi was achieving a good deal of success, in forging links with the pan-Islamists, a section of the Muslim leadership who by then had become somewhat suspicious about the intention of the empire, suspicious about the policy that Britain was going to adopt towards Turkey, the Sultan of Turkey, and who, as you know, was regarded as the Caliph, as the Khalifa, the head of the Islamic world. Turkey had joined the war against the Allied powers, and once defeated, the pan-Islamists felt that the British were going to be vengeful towards the Sultan of Turkey. Because of this apprehension, they started a campaign for Khilafat, protection of the Caliph. Obviously, of course, this Khilafat movement would become much more powerful, much more important later, from 1920 onwards, when a connection would be established between non-cooperation and Khilafat, at the time when Gandhi would start an even more important agitation against British Empire. But by early 1919, Gandhi was anticipating this kind of a connection by linking up with people like Abdul Bari, for example. He was a traditional Islamic preacher from Firangi Mahal at Lucknow, Abdul Bari, and he had his many followers among a group of Muslim leaders known as the Young Party. I have talked about the Young Party on several occasions earlier. We know that some people like Shaukat Ali and Muhammad Ali, the famous Ali brothers, who became very distinctive during the Khilafat agitation, had already become unhappy with the way the moderates in the Aligarh school, the followers of Syed Ahmed Khan, were practicing loyalism. They knew that by practicing loyalism, nothing tangible would be achieved. So such people who constituted the Young Party in the Muslim League, who had their alignments with the pan-Islamists who were anti-British because of their suspicion about the British intention towards Turkey, all these men rallied behind Gandhi. People like Hakim Ajmal Khan or Dr. Ansari in Delhi, these people who would later on become important in the Congress party, were drawn into this Rowlatt Bill agitation by Gandhi. So if you are actually looking the detailed history of how this movement was organized, you see how the connections that Gandhi had started forging with different kinds of people became very useful for him to organize this major agitation. But then, any agitation for that matter goes through phases. Satyagraha Sabha was the first phase. And the idea was for the Satyagraha Sabha to circulate the information about how this particular act was very dangerous and how there was a need for the people to organize resistance against this act. And as a part of this campaign, Gandhi decided to organize a hartal in every part of India. 30th March was initially decided as the date when this hartal would be held, but then this date was deferred to 6th of April. Since Satyagraha Sabha was very powerful and influential in Western India, people who signed the Satyagraha pledge, who actually committed themselves to become involved in this agitation, largely came from Western India. We find that among the 982 signatories who signed the Satyagraha pledge, only 84 were from outside Sindh, Bombay and Gujarat. But you have Gandhi's opponents among the liberals, Tej Bahadur Sapru, S.N. Banerjee, who were willing to collaborate with the British in making Montagu Chelmsford reform successful. So such men were not willing to sail with Gandhi's tide. But then you have also had this regional problem, because in many parts of India, Gandhi did not have an immediate following. Gandhi's leadership or Gandhi's following was limited in certain regions. But as you know, that in many such instances, certain regions which would not figure so importantly in the initial stage of a movement would suddenly shoot into prominence as the main storm centers of the movement. So it is in this, when you see this transition taking place from the initial planning of a movement and then the sudden expanse of the movement, sudden transformation of the nature of the movement, you see the movement playing a very catalytic role.
So in what sense exactly do you think that this was a catalyst in Gandhi's decision for a mass mobilization?
This is a very important question, because that ultimately takes us back to the point that I was making in the very early part of the discussion, that there are moments when an event plays a catalytic role. You have local grievances. There are several studies of the movement on a local scale. You have studies on Delhi, Rowlatt Satyagraha at Delhi. You have studies on Rowlatt Satyagraha at Lahore, at Amritsar, studies by scholars who have gone into the political arithmetic of the local situation. They have analyzed how from an earlier time grievances were accumulating in many of these cities of North India and Punjab, where Gandhi didn't have a Satyagrahi following, but then suddenly Punjab's towns became very volatile. At Lahore, where artisans were complaining about the rising prices, at Delhi, where similar grievances were articulated by artisans in lace work and embroidery work, for which Delhi was very well known. Groups in Lahore as well, you have artisanal concentrations in Amritsar, people who had already had grievances for other reasons. I mean, for rising prices, for the kind of extremely racist government policy of Michael O Dwyer, the governor of Punjab. You know how O Dyer's regime was extremely racist, and this racism was later manifest in the manner in which General Dyer, who was responsible for the killing of unarmed civilians in Jallianwala Bagh on 13th April, as a sequel to this hartal on the 6th of April. All this actually shows how the situation, there were local factors in many of these cities where the movement became very strong. I have already suggested that this movement was strong only in the towns. Once again, you can see regional variations. Calcutta was not very volatile, but Bombay was quite responsive to this agitation. But in Bombay, the movement could be controlled by the Satyagraha Sabha more effectively. But unlike in Bombay, where you have this kind of Gandhian outfit exercising its control over the movement, in Punjab and Delhi, the movement actually exceeded the Gandhian limits. But the violence that the participants in the movement actually resorted to a large extent, was a response to the massive state violence that the government had unleashed on people. You have Amritsar firing on the 10th of April. When the news of Gandhi's arrest actually reached these towns, I mean, as you know, Gandhi was asked not to leave Bombay. Gandhi tried to defy the law. On the 9th of April, he was brought out of the train. On the 10th of April, he was arrested. On the 10th of April, there was a meeting at Amritsar which was fired upon. Martial law was proclaimed. Similar things happened at Ahmedabad, where people became violent. But Punjab is especially important because the Punjab violence, which known as the Punjab disturbances, had led to the institution of a Hunter Commission that the government of India actually instituted in order to inquire into the reasons for unrest. You have, on the other hand, the Congress non-official inquiry committee, which also came up with these reports. All these reports, whether the government Hunter Commission report or the Congress inquiry committee report, reveals that in Punjab's towns, there were people who had become disaffected by the rising prices. But they also, particularly the Congress Inquiry Committee, draws attention to the racist nature of the regime. Racism was very acute in Michael O Dwyer's regime. And as I said, that this was manifest in the way General Dwyer wished to contain unrest by teaching Indians a moral lesson. After he had fired upon the unarmed people at Jallianwala Bagh, he wanted to teach the Indians a moral lesson by forcing them to give obeisance to Englishmen, to salam the Sahabs, to crawl. They were exposed to flogging, and all sorts of corporal punishments and insults and humiliations were meted out to Indians. So this was one particular experience which underlined the essential alienation between the imperial regime and the Indian people. So if we are actually talking about the significance, you have this significance. Even though Gandhi, realizing that the movement had exceeded the limits that he wished to impose on the movement, had become violent in many places, came to describe it as a Himalayan blunder.
So are you to believe then that Rowlatt Satyagraha had no significance, since the author of the Satyagraha is declaring this as a blunder?
Gandhi at that particular moment realized that the manner in which he wished to organize the movement could not be achieved. It was a failure to the degree that he failed to undo the Rowlatt Act. He wanted to continue with the movement for some time. He never dissolved the Satyagraha Sabha. There were other issues which were raised. For example, the law which proscribed literature became another issue. Gandhi wished to defy this law by circulating proscribed literature. Ultimately, it was found that many of the people who became associated with the movement decided to backtrack. I mean, no longer that kind of enthusiasm was generated. And Gandhi himself, when he attended the Amritsar Congress in December 1919, spoke in favor of Indian participation in the Montfort reforms. There was opposition in the Congress. There were people who felt that the reform was inadequate, but some people had broken away from the Congress and had formed the Liberal Party who wished to work the reform. Gandhi, instead of taking a completely negative position, went to the Amritsar Congress in December 1919 and told the audience that if you are opposing Montagu Declaration, I am going to support it. So it was a different kind of stance that Gandhi was taking by the close of the year, but Gandhi was given to these things. Gandhi used to shift his grounds. Gandhi would take time to reflect on the possible consequences of a movement that he was about to launch. In 1920, once again, he would move. I mean, people who would be willing to enter the legislative councils and work the reforms would find Gandhi as an opponent of this. So even though Gandhi looked upon the Rowlatt Satyagraha as a Himalayan blunder, the Rowlatt Satyagraha certainly deserves a certain degree kind of importance in the history of Indian nationalism because of Gandhi's ability to bring different types of people together. People who were unhappy or who had grievances for different kind of reasons converged with the mainstream nationalist agitation and rallied behind Gandhi. Soon, in another year, he was going to make a far more powerful attempt to challenge the British, challenge the imperial rule, which came with the non-cooperation Khilafat movement, where he was going to make use of his connections with the Khilafatists. He would actually voice his opinion against council entry. He would start the most important, powerful agitation in India in the 1920s. So I think that even though Gandhi had described the movement in this manner, Rowlatt Satyagraha, the movement against the Act, is a very important happening in Indian history, a momentous occasion when we can see an important turnaround in Indian politics.